Hi, I'm Dan Rundy. I'm a senior vice president at CSIS. I really appreciate all of you being here. We're having a conversation today about defeating corruption and promoting democracy, the role of USAID. USAID's been working on anti-corruption issues for more than 20 years. CSIS published a paper. We published a paper in April of 2020 suggesting that given great power competition, the United States needs to get back at the front of the anti-corruption parade and lead on these issues. Globally, corruption is a vote-moving issue. There are enormous costs to corruption, and it holds back private investment and jobs. Ultimately, civil society, religious institutions, the private sector, and governments need to create coalitions to defeat corruption. USAID is a catalytic funder, a convener, a talent developer, and a policy partner to help make these sorts of changes and coalitions happen. We've got a really interesting group to help us to unpack this discussion today. My longtime friend, Assistant Administrator for the Europe and Eurasia Bureau, Brock Bierman, is going to make some opening comments, and then he'll join a panel discussion that we're having. So I'm going to, without further ado, turn the floor over to Assistant Administrator Brock Bierman. Brock?
Hey, thanks, Dan, and thanks to everyone who is joining us today. I greatly appreciate your hosting this very, very important event, which I think will inform the audience on the development priorities for Europe and Eurasia moving forward. I also want to thank you, Dan, for being a personal champion of USAID and for development. Your role in helping us accomplish our goals has been clear, and we are very appreciative. Let me just get right to the point. Simply put, corruption in Europe and Eurasia is among the greatest long-term challenges to the region's democratic development. When it is as widespread as it is, it overwhelms every aspect of a nation's path to self-reliance, and corruption will ultimately lead down a path of destruction and an authoritarian approach to government. While some forms of corruption seem invisible, each citizen pays for a real price, if you will. This is a tragic problem because every day that I have spent on the ground in this region reinforces my belief that the countries of Europe and Eurasia have tremendous potential. And that potential, unfortunately, is hurt by the corruption that exists. And USAID has been working in the region for, as you said, Dan, close to 30 years, helping our partners build institutions and overcoming corruption wherever it appears. Unfortunately, corruption is not only pervasive, but it's unrelenting. According to a recent International Republican Institute poll in Moldova, corruption is one of the citizens' top 5 concerns. And in recent Ukrainian poll, and I know we have online the former mission director, Susan Fritz, she knows all too well that corruption was the #1 concern and easily superseding the economic development, ongoing conflict, or any other issue, including the pandemic. And that's a real issue that we have to address in Ukraine. Europe and Eurasia also earn the dubious distinction, if you will, of the second lowest performing region in the world, according to Transparency International 2019 Corruption Perception Index. And, you know, that basically means that we have a serious ongoing issue, and democracy must be continually to push back on this corruption. It relies on a collective belief that each citizen has the ability to build a life and make positive change in their nation. Like a finely crafted watch, as I like to say, its operation, Dan, depends on an interlocking series of gears. If one of those pieces is missing, then the watch just won't work. Very much like corruption. We have to have all of those gears working correctly and simultaneously in order to be able to have a fine instrument. Democracy requires judicial institutions to be fair and efficient and impartial. Free and independent media must be unified, and to question power, to give power the pushback when disinformation is prevalent. Civil society organizations must enable collective action to represent citizen voices, and they must be able to check on the government's power. Each of these pillars, as interdependent, if you will, or are interdependent, when they are working in harmony, it promotes social trust and citizen responsive governance. Corruption is an action that corrodes these pillars, And so let me just briefly summarize the view as I see it and the challenge of corruption in the ENE region. First off, I think that corruption incentivizes those at every level of society who seek to personally enrich themselves rather than serving the public. And it can very well start at the top, but all levels are vulnerable. Corruption deters economic investment, and it drains public funds that would otherwise go to hospital and schools infrastructures, and thus hindering economic growth and investing in the country's people. Corruption opens a door for a multitude of corrupt actors to manipulate their economies and the governments in the region. And most importantly, corruption demoralizes its citizenry by undermining the faith in government. Listen, the heart of democracy is citizen participation. When people feel apathetic toward the process, corruption will flourish. And let me be clear, corruption is a problem everywhere in the world, including the United States. And we are far from having all of the answers, but we can offer our commitment to moving in the right direction and our solidarity with those who will partner with us. We must continue to work together with our partners in the region and around the world to tackle these challenges wherever they arise, and partnerships benefit from both parties. I look forward to talking a little bit about that later during our panel discussion. And for decades, USAID has helped our partners foster the elements required to combat corruption and deliver results to citizens, taking a comprehensive approach to the multifaceted challenge that corruption presents. And let me just give you a couple of examples. In the last few years alone, we have strengthened the independence, professionalism of journalism, the capacity and transparency of judicial systems from Kosovo to Georgia. We've supported watchdog organizations which monitor and report on government operations and serve as a safeguard to civil society organizations, which are often subject to misdirection, which erroneously seeks to paint them as vectors of corruption themselves. We continue to support investigative journalists engaged in exposing national and regional corruption schemes, and the cross-border nature of many of these organizations enable them to delve into a multinational nature of many of these different operations that work against one another. And we continue to support the development of the EU complement domestic and regional energy markets that enable fair and transparent competition and reduce political influence. And finally, we continue to advance and development of fair, predictable business enabling environments and transparent law-based economic governance. As our examples, just as of our work, and I'll just briefly touch upon a few examples. Just a few days ago, we hosted a kickoff conversation with the USATA, the US-Albania Transparency Academy, which will serve as a living symbol of US government support of Albania's democratic and economic aspirations by bringing different actors to the table, different sectors to the table to address Albanian society's issue with corruption. USAID's support of the Organized Crime and Corruption Reporting Project has helped the organization produce stories like the Russian laundromat, and these journalists have uncovered an immense fraud scheme that enabled at least $20 billion, Dan, from the Russian government to be stolen through bribery and the exploitation of various legal and banking systems, including those in Moldova and Latvia. And finally, our partnership with the German Marshall Fund. USAID is supporting local civil society organizations, audit agencies, ombudsmen, anti-corruption agencies to shine a light on the government responses to the pandemic. And for example, in Ukraine, and I know that Susan might talk about this a little later, USAID supported the activation and coordination of 24 civil society groups to oversee public resources expenditures to address COVID-19. These are just a few examples, Dan, of the work that USAID is doing in the arena. These examples provide a glimpse of our efforts to combat corruption, but I think they also reveal the scope and scale of the challenge. At the same time, they demonstrate that USAID's decade-long investment in the region is paying off. The pillars of democracy have helped to support and confronting this challenge head on. The state of affairs is even more pressing given today's geopolitics, unfortunately, and individuals and institutions with malign intentions are using corruption and the weak institutions they produce as an entry point to achieve their own goals. They bribe public officials and they use the courts to clean their money, and they use subservient media organizations to create chaos on social media. and confuse people and misdirect attention. And just as corruption has impacts in every sector of our society, we must continue to take an equally comprehensive approach to anti-corruption. From judicial reform to building government capacity, from fostering a vibrant civil society to independent media, to ensuring a legal and regulatory environment conducive to economic growth, and finally to energy markets as well. We must continue to partner with those who share our vision. And finally, we must remember that corruption is an ongoing problem, that we have to continually work. Since the very beginning of this Bureau's establishment, we have seen corruption rear its ugly head, and we have to continue to push back. And in fact, as we all know, with Russia's main opposition leader Navalny's arrest on Sunday, those would-be authoritarians outside of Russia may take this as a signal to follow suit in their own countries. And it's clear that there are still those in power that carry on the lasting legacy from nearly 75 years of dysfunctional Soviet rule. We must think about the next generation of leaders. And I'm excited today that Yuella is here to join in this conversation while we equip her and our young leaders with the tools they will need to lead this effort and move away from the norms of the previous generation. This transformation requires sustained commitment, and ultimately, democracy hinges on citizens' participation and collective faith in it. We must continue to support the people of Europe and Eurasia, from Ukraine to Azerbaijan, in the quest for democratic, competent governments which create the conditions for opportunities and prosperity for all. USAID's tailored approach to anti-corruption in Europe and Eurasia will continue to inform USAID's strategy for addressing corruption around the world, and corruption will remain an existential threat to lasting, broad-based prosperity and citizen-centered governance elsewhere, everywhere. And further, and finally, it can never be truly eradicated. I think we all need to understand that. All democracies must remain vigilant for the signs of corruption wherever they arise. The future of democracy is on the line, and now it's more important than ever that we push back in corruption and we form partnerships to defeat it. Thank you.
Thanks, Brock. So we have a panel with Brock will be joining, including Susan Fritz, who's a recently retired USAID Foreign Service Officer, was Mission Director Ukraine and Belarus, as well as in other parts of Europe. Primarily, most of her career in Europe and Eurasia, but served in Africa and other places as well. Had a background in democracy and governance. We have Juella Hamadi, who's a student leader from Albania. Thanks, Juella, for being here. We have Frank Brown of the well-regarded institution known as CIPE, the Center for International Private Enterprise, that works at the intersection of economic growth and good governance and works a lot on these issues of corruption issues. So Susan, could you talk about the evolution of corruption in your career in international development? You recently retired, and I'm going to put the term retired in quotes because I don't see you as having retired, but transitioned from your time at AID. But I can remember that in 1996 was when President Wolfensohn gave a major speech on corruption at the World Bank, when it was sort of okay to talk about corruption in a more open way, is only since 1996. So that's about 25 years ago. Could you talk a little bit about the evolution of how AID has thought about corruption, perhaps in the context of the larger democracy, rights, and governance agenda?
Sure. Thanks, Dan. So I began working on democracy building programs in Europe and Eurasia in the early 90s as the Berlin Wall fell. And I would say in the early days, as you alluded to, corruption wasn't even on the agenda. It didn't become an issue till later in these countries' development. But I think, in reflecting for today and preparing for today, I was thinking about it. The roots of corruption were laid in those early days, but we just weren't aware of it with the privatization processes going on in those countries. So our focus was on civil society, media, political processes, parliamentary and judicial strengthening. Our governance work, where you would undertake anti-corruption programming, or the heart of it, we focus on local governance and decentralization, because our thinking in those days was that the central governments are strong enough. They're too powerful. So let's work on decentralizing power. And I think that was a missed opportunity for us to focus on making national governments more transparent, and really introducing measures that would reduce opportunities for corruption at the national level. So then when aid started to engage in, I would say, the mid to late 90s on anti-corruption programming, it was very unidimensional. So we would look at, okay, in civil society, we can support watchdogs who are shining a light on government processes that may be corrupt. Or we would look at judicial systems and ethics codes and things like that for judges. But we didn't look at it holistically, and I think we missed the boat on that, quite honestly. But the reason behind that, I think, was multifactored. One is that we didn't have resources. We, in the Europe and Eurasia region, our resources were going down pretty significantly in the 2000s, and so declining budget, so we couldn't look at things holistically. I think we didn't understand corruption and how complex and rooted it was, and the need for a multi-dimensional approach. And lastly, I would say that the political will in many of the countries in which we were working was just simply missing. So as Brock alluded to in his remarks, a more comprehensive approach has evolved over time, and that's what we have found has been more successful. And I could talk later about the Ukraine case and sort of how we approached it there, but that's the history.
Joella, you're a student activist in Albania. You work with USAID. You work with you have been involved in politics in your country. Talk about how is if I say the word corruption in Albania, what's your reaction to those two words?
I've been hearing about corruption since I can remember. So when Assistant Administrator Bierman mentioned earlier that corruption cannot be fully eradicated, I remember that when I was probably in primary school, I heard one of my teachers saying the same thing, and I was so surprised because I felt that corruption could be eradicated, completely. So since I can remember, I've been hearing about corruption, and the corruption has been, a very big issue, especially, in 2005 when a political party won the campaign by promising to tackle the corruption. And actually, I'm very glad that we are talking about corruption today because corruption, for me as a young person, it impacts my life every day. As I'm sure you all here know, one of the biggest issues in our region, but especially in my country, Albania, is dealing with brain drain. And majority of the people who choose to leave the country are actually well-educated young people. And the reason why they do that is because the unemployment rate is high, chances to find a job without knowing somebody are low. And even when those people have a good job, actually, they still need the healthcare services one day, which is, not in a very good condition. And the healthcare system here in general is a symbol for corruption. And almost all Albanian families have had to, unfortunately, corrupt the doctor or nurse to get the attention needed for their family members. We don't have enough schools. We don't have good roads. And all these problems I mentioned lead us actually to a single source, which is corruption. And it is because of corruption that we nowadays don't have enough hospitals, enough roads. We have a very high youth migration. And the bad thing about it is that according to a study on corruption, 78% of the Albanians don't believe anything else can be done to reduce it. And that's why people leave, I think, because they think that this cancer won't allow them to progress, to have a good or to have a healthy life. And at least 44% of the Albanians have admitted that they have been asked for a bribe. And the likelihood of corruption pressure in Albania is 80%, which is very bad, And in North Macedonia is 84%, which, the corruption is, a very big problem in the whole region. So no one wants it, but it has become so normal that it's not even treated as the big issue that it is, unfortunately. But I'm very glad to say that, the youth shares the vision that Assistant Administrator Bierman talked about earlier, that we have, that's why we have, I think, the main responsibility to help the stakeholders and our partners to tackle the corruption, because we also are the main beneficiaries of this anti-corruption fight. So yeah.
Good. So Frank Brown, thanks for being with us. CIPE works on anti-corruption work all over the world. Could you talk a little bit how it's evolved from where you sit? And also, you've played a key role in putting the US-Albania Transparency Academy together. Could you talk a little bit about how it's evolved and talk about USATA? And then I want to come back to Joelle and have her talk about USATA from her vantage point. So Frank? Thanks,
Dan. And thanks again for having me. So our work has evolved tremendously in the last 10 years or so at CIPE. And as a reminder, CIPE is affiliated with the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and has a distinctly sort of private sector, business-oriented point of view. In the early days, we worked hard to strengthen business associations and chambers of commerce. And in markets like Albania, we were hearing constantly at the degree to which the informal economy and the political connections of larger companies was putting at a disadvantage small and medium-sized enterprises. And partly in response to that, over the years in Albania and elsewhere in Europe and Eurasia, we've developed a somewhat more sophisticated approach that builds upon the work with chambers and business associations to look at global value chains and the degree to which requirements like the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act, the US law, or the UK Bribery Act, or the many other pieces of legislation that govern how multinationals behave overseas, how we can leverage those requirements in emerging markets to get local companies to change their behavior. So in other words, if local companies want to join global value chains, they need to start to manage their corruption risk. So our CIPE's work has really changed a good deal in that regard, in that we're becoming much more aware of how we can leverage global financial flows and global requirements to bring about change in markets like Albania. We're also looking more and more at government procurement as a key leverage point, and we often will do this in cooperation with USAID in various markets, but looking at government procurement as a pain point for corrupt actors in various governments. Because if we can bring local activists on the ground, many of them small businessmen, up to speed on how to hold their governments accountable when those procurements take place, and to demand transparency, to demand fair tenders, then you can begin to bring about change, not only by having better tenders and getting more bang for your taxpayer revenue, but also just by virtue of activating the community and showing the degree to which corruption is robbing folks of their tax revenue and the way it's spent. And all those sensibilities and the work we've been doing in Albania since the 1990s has fed into our role at the Transparency Academy. So all those experiences, both in Albania and from around the world, have helped shape our involvement.
Joelle, talk about your involvement with the U.S. the Transparency Academy, please.
Again, I want to thank Assistant Administrator Bierman for helping shape and also for the initiative, because as I said earlier, we really much need it. The Academy launched last week, and I'm very glad about it, because as maybe many of you know, the political environment in Albania is very polarized, unfortunately, and this doesn't create many opportunities for cooperation between stakeholders. But the academy, which was launched last week, I think it will create some pressure for stakeholders to take this seriously and to fight corruption and to sit in the same table together. And U.S. is of course our most important and powerful ally, but we wouldn't be of a much high value to the U.S. as a partner if the corruption levels would be high, because it would mean we are a weak country with a weak economy, with a weak judicial system, education system, healthcare, etc. But it could also impact our national security. So I'm very glad for the academy, because I think that more pressure, more monitoring would also make us a stronger ally. And the academy is still in the first phase, but we all have high hopes that this is going to, of course, not eradicate corruption completely. You know, we don't expect that. We just and we don't expect the academy or the US to do the job for us. You know, we know that we have to play our part as well. But I am sure that this is as this is the first serious step since I can remember, since I'm active in politics and civil society as well. This is the first serious step that being taken to tackle corruption. So I'm sure that in maybe 1 or 2 years you'll be and we will be hearing reports of it as a success story.
Excellent. So, Assistant Administrator Bierman, could you talk about what was the thinking by the Bureau and the mission in Albania for putting together the US-Albania Transparency Academy? It seems like a great idea.
And it is, Dan. And I do want to just take a second to address something Susan said, because I really think this is an important message, especially since I'm reading some of the questions that are coming up that I don't think we're going to get all to those questions, but it's an important point, right? Look, there isn't a day that doesn't go by that I don't come to work trying to put myself out of a job, right? The day that we close our doors in our partner countries is a day that we can celebrate a successful implementation of programs to create a partner, an ally, a trading partner, someone who can walk hand in glove with helping others in need. Having said that, resources are important and understanding the mission is critical, and that if we haven't finished the job, that we have to take that into consideration. Look, I don't know when we'll be closing the final door of any of our countries, but I do know this: we can't leave too soon, and we have to make sure that we finish the job. And those that focus and the resources is critical. When I arrived at the Bureau, we were considered the Sunset Bureau, and as I think back about what I've hopefully been able to accomplish in the course of the last 3 years with the help of a tremendous group of professionals, the most professional group of dedicated public servants I've ever worked with, is getting the agency to refocus on the importance of Europe and Eurasia and what's going on, not just in corruption, not just with CMKI, not just with energy, and not just with working with the youth, but understanding that we haven't finished the job in E&E. Look, in 2015, we were at about, our FY15 budget was probably close to $215 million. Don't quote me on this, rough numbers. We've more than doubled that by now. We've increased staffing numbers. We've increased our funding levels. We've increased our communications. We've increased all of the work that we have done because it's so important right now to push back on the Kremlin, to push back on Communist China, to help build a capacity amongst our institutions. And that's where I'm going to get into USATA and answer your question, Dan. But to help our countries become true partners in the sense of the word. And, I do believe that the use of tax dollars toward development is one of the best returns on investment that we can ask for as taxpayers. I mean, look, we all know that it's less than 0.5% that goes to foreign assistance, and even less that goes into development. And when I tell you how important it is, the work that we're doing that will last for generations, that will create those partnerships, right? Not just throughout government, but in the private sector, that will have legs for generations to come. It started with a lot of the programs that we have instituted and founded here in the E&E Bureau. But look, I'm extremely proud of the work that we're doing in Albania, and specifically the work with USATA. Look, that academy really was a collaborative approach to fighting corruption. It happened during a meeting with the Prime Minister, with our mission director, and with Mark Green, really headlining that conversation and saying, what is it that we can do to help Albania? And when we think about transitioning, I think about the Prime Minister's comment that we don't need the money as much as we need your know-how, right? And so that know-how is to try to put together partnerships, to put together different parts of society, whether it's civil society, whether it's judiciary, whether it's a government, or whether whether it's the private sector or nonprofits. The fact of the matter is, it's an all-encompassing approach, if you will, encompassing approach to pushing back on corruption. And I'm hopeful, right, that USATA doesn't just lead to defeating, if you will, and pushing back on corruption in Albania, but is a model for the entire region that we can actually lift up and take to other parts of the region as well.
I've got some really interesting questions. Let me start with, for Ms. Hamadi, I work at IRI on the United States Albania Transparency Academy program funded by USAID. This is from Randolph Kent at IRI. One of the key challenges I expect the program to face is the low level of trust and belief on the part of Albanian youth that Albania can fight corruption. As a representative of Albanian youth, how do you try to persuade other youth that Albania can change? Great question.
So, as I said earlier, brain drain and youth immigration is a very big issue here. So many people are choosing to leave instead of fighting. You know, I'm one of the people who is not doing that. And first of all, I think that I try to encourage every young person that I meet, including my friends, not to leave and give their example. But this is, you know, like personally, but on a more organized level, I would say that through a great initiative such as European Democracy Youth Network, that again, Assistant Administrator Bierman helped us found and launched. We have young people coming together in Albania, but not only in Albania, in 22 European countries, coming together from civil society and from political parties, which is something that has never been done before. And the reason why we do that is exactly for these cases when we try to fight corruption. If we don't sit everybody to the table, then we cannot change things. You know, we cannot continue ignoring people who are in front of us, even though we live in a very polarized country like Albania. Through EDIN, we are trying to offer our own example that by cooperating, we can actually change things. So one of the things that I can do as a young leader, I would say, or as a young person, is encourage everyone to join EDIN so they can have a stronger voice and they can help us change things. And we do that together for our own future. And that, I mean, our network is expanding every day. And, you know, I'm very glad to say that. And I also, I hope that EDIN will be a very important tool for the Transparency Academy here and for IRI and NDI to help implement.
Great. So Susan, can I ask you to react a little bit in terms of this question, in terms of from your, you just more broadly beyond Albania, how do you expect, you know, in countries where there's low level of trust and belief that a country can fight corruption? What's your response to that?
Well, I think a great example of that was in Ukraine, where people got fed up with corruption, and that, of course, the Maidan Revolution was all about corruption. I think, you know, you don't want it to get to a revolution. You want to start mitigating the impacts of corruption and reducing opportunities where you can. And I think it takes a partnership of various stakeholders. We've been talking about a number of them today. We haven't talked much about the business sector, but I think, you know, Frank, I'm sure, has some views on that. I think it does take trying to find those players and parties and small p parties that have an interest in reducing opportunities for corruption. You bring them together where you can. I mean, you're not going to find political will everywhere, but you try to create it by working with civil society, and then you have to dig deep and find within institutions people who want to make a difference. And I think you also need to offer some incentives. I mean, I think one of the more powerful programs and more successful programs we've had in Ukraine is our TAPAS program, which is basically e-governance and e-procurement. e-procurement, the Prozoro system started out as a civil society-based initiative that eventually, with USAID support, with the enterprise fund's initial support, and then USAID came in behind that with a lot more resources. And you basically, you find the people who want to make a difference and you build on their efforts. I think in terms of e-governance, if you walk into national government offices, different ministries, and say, you want to fight corruption? And we've done that in some of our programs. And, that's a hard sell. But if you go in and say, hey, do you want to set up e-governance systems that make it easier for people to get their services? Yeah, everybody wants that. And at the same time, what you're ending up doing is you're creating a more transparent system and you're reducing opportunities for corruption at the same time. So I think you have to meet people in countries where they are and find those actors who want to make a difference, and you work with them.
Frank, could you chime in here on this question? I think it's a good one from IRI.
Yes. And first, though, I wanted to praise Susan for what I think are very wise words regarding political will and incentives, because without those two elements, regardless of where you're working, any sort of anti-corruption effort won't be successful. And as I'm sure she observed in Ukraine, one of the reasons that revolution of dignity succeeded back in 2014 was because you had entrepreneurs, small business associations, which were tremendously frustrated with the status quo, with levels of corruption, with being cut out of government procurement. And they took to the streets and they helped finance the revolution that was successful. They provided resources. And there's been a good deal of academic research on this as well, especially by Alina Mungiu-Pipidi, the Romanian scholar who's now at the Hertie School in Berlin, that an anti-corruption movement won't be sustainable unless you can capture the entrepreneurs and that mercantile class that is very, very sensitive and very, very quick to take to the streets. If you get them on board and you engage them in a sustained way politically, then you can bring about change, whether it's the entrepreneurs and the business association. The other thing I'd mention is that these associations, in order to enjoy a competitive advantage, will often set a standard that's higher than what's legally necessary. So in other words, if they want to do business with, say, European or US actors, they collectively will put in place a voluntary standard to which they're checked in order to enjoy a competitive advantage. And those are the kinds of forces that we need to harness. And to the IRI question, youth, young folks starting out new businesses, small businesses, often one-person businesses, are in this category and are very, very sensitive, very vulnerable, and also unburdened by sort of old school thinking. These are folks who are young, they're ambitious, they want to get ahead, they know how it works elsewhere, they're willing to take risks, and they're crucial to harness their energy, their intellect in driving forward change. That's been SIPE's experience.
So this is great. So Brock, could I ask you to talk a little bit, talk about CMKI, because you have the USATA as one example, but I would argue that CMKI, what is CMKI and how does it push back against it? What are some of the anti-corruption dimensions to CMKI, please?
Let me unmute here. So first of all, I'm really proud of the work we've done around countering malign criminal influence. We have, as an agency, taken the lead on that from day one. We have been, if you will, replicated by other agencies and other departments in terms of the framework and having that conversation. We have been able to intertwine the CMKI framework into our development strategies across the board, which we've been working on over the course of the last 3 years. And we've just recently finished all of our countries' strategies. But it's basically taking an approach that, one, creates pillars to address the issues, right? So looking at it from a democracy and governance standpoint, looking at it from an economic development standpoint, looking at it from an energy independence standpoint, and then finally looking at it from a media and disinformation standpoint. And so I think what we've tried to do is we've tried to create what we think is a very flexible strategy that can be incorporated into the CDCS process internally, so that it helps our mission.
CDCS for people who don't follow.
Right. Yeah, so that's our country strategies for individual countries. But what I'm suggesting is that we've thought through what are the most important issues, and we've talked about specifically how we can push back on various programs, whether it's at strengthening media and helping citizens understand what fake news is, or helping governments understand that building capacities within their institutions help them make better decisions and independent decisions that are not relied on by outside actors that would like to leverage their particular resources to help them in that decision-making process. So look, the CMKI effort also is an effort to really call out, if you will, the Kremlin on its behavior, on its use of its energy resources, in its efforts to corrupt public officials, but also it's an effort to try to find some common ground. And I think it is important that we talk about that too, Dan, because during this conversation, it's not all about countering, right? If we can find areas that we can work together on, right, we should take that opportunity. And that's why we don't call it countering Russian malign influence. It's strictly Kremlin, and we have been very focused on that in it by itself.
Okay, so there's a question here about U.S. funded agencies promoting the use of technology on financial management to promote good governance and transparency. Maybe this is a question, maybe Frank or Susan, could you just talk about this issue about using new technologies on financial management to promote good governance and transparency? Other examples beyond Ukraine, and Brock, you may have examples of this too, but Susan, maybe we could start with you. You saw this probably most recently in Ukraine, but I suspect you may have be seeing this in other contexts as well. I'd welcome that. And let me start. How about why I start with Frank, given that you cover the world, Frank? So let me start with you, Frank.
Well, I just note two things. One is that these various financial management tools, or generally sort of tech solutions, will only get you so far. So, a couple of years ago, we were looking at a new technology used for government procurement, and that was, we discovered very quickly that it was sort of garbage in, garbage out. That if the inputs to this very sophisticated system were not good, or the outputs were not used correctly, then it didn't have much effect. The other point I wanted to make is that in the age of COVID, there's been a tremendous push towards e-governance and e-procurement out of necessity, because folks can't go into the office anymore. And there's some real dividends to be had through this. Walmart, for example, has a really neat program going in Peru where they are supporting local governments and national government on e-governance issues, because it's in Walmart's best interest, right, to be able to act more efficiently, more transparently, to comply better. But it's having this knock-on benefit for democratic institutions in that it's forcing things into the open, and there's a greater degree of transparency.
Susan, do you want to comment on this?
Yeah, and I don't have much in terms of financial management technology, but just building on Frank's comments about e-procurement and particularly in the Ukraine case. So the ProZorro system, obviously, I think is very unique and has advanced transparency in that country and transparency in procurement, and reduced opportunities for corruption by millions and millions of dollars. The other piece of that I think is interesting to bring in is DoZorro, which is technology that basically allows civil society to monitor public procurement through the ProZorro system in a way where they can pick up irregularities. So it's not just, I think, corrupt actors get one step ahead of you, right? And so even if you have an e-procurement system that is great, there are holes, and so and corrupt actors will find those holes. So what we've been able to do is use technology to help civil society to monitor procurement systems and Prozoro more specifically, to identify where people are taking advantage and where there are some anomalies or some strange behavior going on in terms of procurements. And so we're trying to develop those tools as these countries are developing their systems and trying to get ahead of the corrupt actors. Again, I don't have anything on the financial management side, but I think e-procurement is, and the technology around e-procurement is huge and has advanced Ukraine significantly.
I've got a question for the four of you. This is from Benjamin Kreutzfeldt. Can any of the panelists elaborate on the link between democracy and corruption? He observes that the economies of many democracies in Southeastern Europe and Latin America are crippled by rampant corruption, but maybe don't have as much vigor, whereas there are some authoritarian regimes, e.g. China, that thrive despite what he describes as moderate levels of corruption, though, I think that may be up for debate. Let me start with you, Susan. Could you respond to that?
Yeah, I'm not sure how to respond to that. If you look at Ukraine and specifically the revolution there, I think, people will only stand for so much. And so, whether a country can function with a lot of corruption, I think it eventually erodes the social contract between government and citizens. And I think that's what we've seen, at least in Ukraine. And I think you're seeing that in Belarus to some extent and elsewhere. So I think, yes, a country can continue with a sort of democratic institutions, but I think to have a more fully developed democracy, corruption needs to be under control. That's just my own personal thinking.
Okay, Frank, what's your reaction to this question?
Again, I would agree wholeheartedly with Susan. And I would just note that ultimately corruption erodes the social contract, the trust between the people and their government, whether it's grand corruption or petty corruption. And as that erosion takes place, it weakens democratic institutions like the judiciary. And sooner or later, everything is up for sale. And when you reach that moment in a society, you're very vulnerable to violent revolutions and change and all kinds of unpleasant things. And whether they come sooner or later, they come. And in a country like China, where the government is incredibly agile and nimble and sophisticated and nuanced in the way it manages the corruption issue by creating a perception of zero tolerance, while at the same time massive grand corruption takes place, whether you're in a state like that or in a state like Belarus or some of the former Soviet republics where the corruption is in your face from day one, the government doesn't manage it well. Either of those cases will end badly if the situation is left untended.
Okay. Brock, do you want to comment on this?
No, I was just, look, there are so many questions that are coming up on the screen, Dan, a lot of really, really good ones. And I hope you don't mind me taking a little independence here and just answering one of the issues about soft power, because I do believe that right now, more than any time in world history, it is important for the United States to support development, foreign assistance through soft power, right? I mean, look, you and I started on the same day under the Bush administration, and we recall the importance of the 3Ds. Although my friend Dan Twining would call it the 4Ds, with democracy being in there as part of that. But at the end of the day, right, many have commented about the fact that if you don't fully fund, right, foreign assistance, they're going to end up having to buy more ammunition. We're going to end up having to spend more money on the backside, if you will. We really have to understand the importance of the development work that we're doing, and that the long-term strategic nature is not going to provide results tomorrow, next week, next year. It's going to be over a period of time. But strategically speaking, it has to be part of foreign policy. And I'm hopeful, right, that the Biden administration understands that and will utilize USAID in a way, right, that puts the development back in those 3Ds. And I think that we've already seen that with the nomination of an administrator and that seat on the Security Council. But just to answer the question about how important soft power is and how important the work we're doing, not just in corruption, not just with USATA, not just with youth, not just with democracy and governance or economic development, but the importance of development work, not just in Europe and Eurasia, but around the world.
Okay, here's a question about COVID. So we're all sitting in our basements on Zoom. So could you all explain how the COVID-19 has impacted the corruption challenge? I've got my own views. Brock, why don't I start with you? I suspect you're seeing how COVID-19's impacted the anti-corruption agenda.
Yeah, sure, Dan. And that's a great question. Look, first off, we're seeing a lot of disinformation around COVID that's creating confusion and misunderstanding. And so pushing back on the disinformation, making sure that people understand what's at stake here, but also that we want to work transparently with governments to make sure that we provide the assistance that's necessary. I think Susan can talk a little bit more in terms of on the ground, specifically working with the governments and working internally with the capacities. But I think that honestly, helping these countries recognize their shortcomings in terms of being able to actually respond to this pandemic has been something that we've been working very hard at USAID. Maybe Susan, you want to build on that?
I have one focus, which is Ukraine, and I haven't been there for about 6 months or 9 months. So, my information's a little bit dated, but I would say COVID, particularly in the early part of the pandemic, really made countering corruption challenging, particularly in the pharmaceutical procurement sphere, where you had the government trying to respond quickly. The Prozoro system has a lot of components to it that don't let you respond quickly. It was built for something else, and so between that and then we were trying to stand up a pharmaceutical procurement body, the Central Procurement Agency, to take over pharmaceutical procurement from international institutions which had been doing it for the past 5 years. And quite honestly, there was a mess in Ukraine, and they went through 3 ministers of health, starting right around the pandemic and so forth. And they undermined our efforts to try to strengthen that body, that procurement body, and I think it created more opportunities for corruption, particularly related to procuring PPE and other things that these countries need to fight. All of our countries need to fight COVID.
In Belarus, we saw how the government responded to COVID, or should I say, lack of response to COVID, and that's a serious problem. But helping civil society understand what the real risks are and understanding where the fake, if you will, information is coming from has been a challenge. But I think we've really done a very, very good and thorough job in actually helping our countries understand how to mitigate some of that fake news, if you will, and how to understand the disinformation that's coming from malign actors, if you will. So I am thinking that beyond just the disinformation end of it, the transparency end of it, we've been continuingly learning new lessons, and I think that we'll be addressing some of those issues moving into the next administration as well.
Frank, could you comment on this issue of COVID and anti-corruption? Then, as Joella, I'd like you to comment on how COVID has impacted anti-corruption, how you're seeing either disinformation or corruption in the context of COVID. But let me start with you, Frank, please.
So I think it's too early to tell, but all the indications in the course of we've put on this 14-part COVID-19 and corruption series at CSIP, talking a lot about the response and a lot about the degree to which ordinary regulations and laws and protocols have been suspended. So for procurement. So many governments have, often for good reason, have suspended ordinary rules in the interest of very quickly getting a vaccine to market or treating the populace. And what that means is that it pushes the door wide open to all kinds of corruption opportunities. And we're seeing early indication that the levels of corruption are huge. So the jury's out. I would urge agencies like the USAID and various US government and agencies in the IMF to put very strict conditionalities on how the money is spent, because you have billions of dollars flowing into non-democratic countries with a blank check to address this issue with not a whole lot of oversight. On the positive side, this is a tremendous opportunity for anti-corruption activists, because nothing gets to people's attention like the health of their family and loved ones and children and friends like this issue. And so if there's a whiff of wrongdoing and corruption and government officials enriching themselves at this time of crisis, that's a time for corruption activists to jump and to really take advantage of what's going on.
Joella, do you want to comment on how, if I said COVID-19, Albania, and the corruption/disinformation, I'd welcome your thoughts.
Unfortunately, there are still no reports on that, but the past year, majority of the accusations by the opposition for the government have been related to what Susan mentioned about public procurements for, I don't know, hospital tools or equipment or etc. So the corruption has been more focused, I would say, the past year. But actually, I wanted to comment on something that you spoke about earlier, which was the relation between democracy and corruption. And I will just give you a very simple example, because we all here agree, I think, that the more corrupt the country is, the less democracy there is in that country. But I would say that there are very concrete examples that I see here in Albania, like vote buying, and where parties buy votes during elections are in poor areas where there are no investments, and people sometimes don't even have a TV to get informed, no access to internet or etc. So this is a very clear and simple example for everyone to understand that a corrupt country is not a democratic country or fully democratic, never.
But Brock, I'm going to give you the last word. We're coming to the end of the hour. You have parting thoughts for us?
No, I appreciate the time, Dan. I appreciate you giving us a platform to talk about corruption and democracy. Look, I think that right now, democracy is under assault by the Kremlin, by communist China, by other malign actors around the world. And we are also suffering from what I think is a lack of understanding of the impact of social media, a 24-hour news cycle. The issues revolving polarization, I think, are issues that we're really going to need to resolve. And I'm hopeful that we can start to look at these issues as a way, or as a whole approach, regardless of whether it's polarization or corruption and democracy, on how we fix these issues and how we address the problems and how we actually come to work together to find that common ground. And I really believe, right, that the work that we're doing at USAID, specifically in our bureau, has been very successful. And I'm very appreciative to all of the members of the staff and our implementing partners, our FSNs. We still have a lot of work to do, Dan. But we're coming to work every single day trying to figure out again how to put ourselves out of a job and create real partners who will be sustainable in a position to help us at some point if we ever need assistance ourselves.
So let me take the opportunity, Brock, thanking you for your service. It was so glad you were assistant administrator for the E&E Bureau. You did a great job. That's not baloney or polite. You know what I mean? Polite baloney or a think tank politeness. That's true. You did a great job. You had a great partnership with Foreign Service officers and FSNs and civil service, and did a number of important things for the Bureau and for development and for the country. So congratulations, Brock. Thanks for your service. And it's not goodbye. It's talk to you next week.
All right. Thanks, Dan.
Okay. Bye. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dan. Thanks, Susan. Be well, Frank.